Hello everyone, this is Showtime 112. When the conflict over the disputed Falklands Islands, or Islas Malvinas, broke out, Argentine Air Force and Navy operated well over 200 aircraft. The British task force sent to recover the islands could initially rely on about 20 Sea Harriers. But the disparity in numbers was quite misleading. Some of the Argentine aircraft were turboprop types. Many aircraft had to be held in reserve for a potential conflict with Chile, and A4 Skyhawks, which made the bulk of the strike component, were not in the best shape, mostly as the result of American embargo caused by human rights violations. In modern warfare, it's very hard to win without establishing aerial superiority, and for that purpose, Argentina relied primarily on their fleet of Mirage 3EA fighters. 12 of them were initially ordered, with first examples arriving in 1973. They were operated by the 8th Fighter Group. 2 were lost in accidents, and 7 more were acquired from France in 1980. This second batch was more advanced, and they could carry Matra R550 Magic infrared missiles. The first batch of Argentine Mirages could only carry R530, a much larger missile available in semi-active radar homing and infrared variants. It was designed primarily to shoot down bombers, and its effectiveness against maneuverable fighters was extremely limited. This left the smaller R550 Magic, along with their 30mm cannons, as the Mirage's only weapons potentially effective against British Harriers. But it was a rear aspect-only missile. Argentine Mirages had to maneuver behind the Harriers to effectively engage them, and maneuverability wasn't one of Mirage's strengths. Another weakness was a relatively short range and lack of air refueling capability. With the runway at Port Stanley too short for fast jets, the Mirages had to carry large 1700-liter drop tanks to be able to reach the islands from Argentine mainland, engage in combat between 5 and 12 minutes depending on altitude, and hope to fly back to their base. Another very similar aircraft which could be used to achieve aerial superiority was the Dagger. This type, bought second-hand from Israel, was originally known as Nesher. This was essentially a renamed Mirage 5, a modified version of Mirage 3. Nesher or Dagger had no radar. It instead carried more fuel, which gave it some more endurance in combat. It could carry 2 Israeli Shafir 2 missiles. This model was based on AIM-9D Sidewinder, and it too was a rear aspect weapon only. Argentina purchased 39 Daggers between 1978 and 1980. Both Argentine fighter types relied very heavily on ground radar guidance. This was provided by a Westinghouse long-range air control and warning radar based near Port Stanley Airfield, called BAM Malvinas by Argentinians. Their British adversaries, Sea Harriers, suffered from some of the same problems. Their Blue Fox radars were limited in range and had almost no look-down capability, especially over land. Their range and endurance in combat was also quite limited. But their maneuverability was much better than the Mirages, and they carried a much more advanced, all-aspect AIM-9L Sidewinder missile. Royal Navy pilots' training and tactics were also better, as we shall see later. On 1st of May 1982, the hostilities began by the famous British Black Buck raid, the single Vulcan bomber attack on the Port Stanley airfield. 2 Argentine Mirages were scrambled in response, but they couldn't establish radio contact with the Port Stanley radar station. Their Cyrano radars had no chance of picking up a contact without precise ground guidance, so they turned back. Sea Harriers from HMS Invincible established 2 cap stations east and northeast of Stanley. This was followed by airstrikes on Port Stanley and Goose Green airfields by Sea Harriers from HMS Hermes. These attacks were described in another video on the channel, watch it if you missed it. A pair of daggers from the 6th Fighter Group, the Toro flight, arrived over the Falkland Strait at that time. The Argentine ground radar couldn't detect the low-flying strike aircraft, so the daggers were directed to intercept a pair of Sea Harriers on Cap Station to the north. The Harriers too were directed by the destroyer HMS Glamorgan as their controller to engage the daggers. As the 2 flights merged, Argentine pilots began circling to the right, searching visually for the Harriers. The British aircraft were 4,000 feet below, and neither flight was able to spot the other. Harrier pilots saw what they interpreted as missile launches, but the daggers didn't launch any missiles, and this was probably just fuel stream from the jettisoned fuel tanks. Both flights turned back and returned to base. After the British airstrikes, the Argentine radar at Port Stanley reported possible landing crafts approaching from the east. As the result, the Argentine command launched 8 A-4 Skyhawks on an armed reconnaissance maritime strike mission. The first of the 2 flights consisted of 4 A-4B Skyhawks from 5th Fighter Group from Rio Gallegos, the Topo flight. They were escorted by 2 Mirage 3s flown by Capitan Gustavo Argentino Garcia Cuerva and Primer Teniente Carlos Perona, who took off from the same airfield. Their call sign was Tablon. The Argentine radar operator confused the 2 flights and initially vectored the Skyhawks against the Northern Sea Harrier Cap, manned by Lieutenant Commander John Ayton Jones and Flight Lieutenant Paul Barton. The Sea Harriers were likewise vectored to intercept them. The Argentine Skyhawks were approaching at low altitude under a cloud layer, while the Harriers remained at 15,000 feet as their radar controller from HMS Glamorgan couldn't give them altitude information. But the Mirage flight leader, Capitan Garcia Cuerva, realized the GCI's mistake, and the Skyhawks were instructed to turn back about 2 miles before the merge. The Harriers also turned back to their cap station, but they were now pursued by the Mirages. This made the Harriers turn back to face them, still at much lower altitude. The Mirage pilots attempted to fire their R-530 missiles, but their radars couldn't achieve a proper lock-in look-down mode. Neither of the 2 flights was willing to come to the other's altitude. As their fuel level was running low, the Mirages then turned back and eventually landed at Rio Gallegos with barely about 200 liters of fuel in their tanks. Carlos Perona remembers that his leader, Capitan Garcia Cuerva, told him that he was so keen on engaging the Sea Harriers that if the next time he were low on fuel, he would try to land at Puerto Argentino, or Port Stanley, and then take off in clean condition to return to the mainland. A series of feints over the East Falklands was flown by Royal Navy Sea King helicopters, and they let the Argentine leadership believe that British Special Forces were being inserted in anticipation of an amphibious landing. They responded by sending special anti-helicopter sweeps of the island. They consisted of 3 pairs of Shafrir-armed A4C Skyhawks with an escort of daggers, but also of 3 T-34 Turbo Mentors which took off from BAN Calderon, a grass airstrip at Pebble Island. The Turbo Mentors were prop trainers with a secondary light attack capability. Although slow and lightly armed, they could still be effective against helicopters. At that time, 2 Harriers were at the Cap Station northeast of Stanley. They were flown by Lieutenant Commander Nigel Sharkey Ward, the CEO of No. 801 Squadron, and Lieutenant Mike Watson. They were also providing cover for 2 frigates conducting anti-submarine warfare operations. They were informed by the HMS Glamorgan that 3 slow contacts were heading north from Stanley. Sea Harriers turned towards them. The 3 contacts were the Argentine Navy's Turbo Mentors in pursuit of a Sea King helicopter which was trying to evade them. Quite amazingly, Lieutenant Watson detected the low-flying Argentine trainers with his radar. Sea Harriers went down through the cloud cover and emerged at the Turbo Mentors 4 o'clock. The Argentine pilots jettisoned their rocket launchers and gun pods and climbed to the clouds. But Sharkey Ward managed to attack one of them with his guns. Teniente de Corbeta Daniel Menzella heard a thump behind him, and then he saw the dark shape of a Sea Harrier which flashed over his cockpit and disappeared. Only one of the gun rounds hit the Turbo Mentor, but he wasn't seriously damaged, and all 3 managed to escape. This was the first aerial engagement of the conflict in which weapons were fired. The 2 Sea Harriers climbed back to altitude, but they were then informed of 2 more bogies coming from southwest, flying high and closing fast. As the Harriers turned towards the bogies, they turned away. Both flights then repeated the maneuver of turning hot and cold until the Harriers eventually reached their cap station at 20,000 feet. The Sea Harriers then turned back into the contact, which was again closing from a higher altitude. British pilots then saw what they interpreted as missiles launched at them, possibly R-530s. The Argentine aircraft turned back west, frustrating the British pilots who were unable to engage them. This was in fact a single dagger flown by Capitan Raul Diaz. His wingman had aborted due to engine problems. Diaz was guided by the ground radar, which kept losing the contact, and so he was instructed to turn back when it happened. Diaz turned into the Sea Harriers one more time, but they seemed to abandon the engagement and descend, so the ground radar lost them again. There is no mention of any missile launch, especially not the R-530, which daggers didn't carry, so again, it might have been fuel tanks which the Sea Harrier pilots saw. All these early engagements between British Sea Harriers and Argentine Mirages and daggers were inconclusive. The Argentine fighters were generally flying on higher altitude, and they were unable to detect or engage Sea Harriers flying on lower altitude. Also, Both sides were unwilling to come to the altitude which suited the other better, which meant high for the Mirages and low for the Sea Harriers. Shortage of fuel or loss of ground radar contact prevented any shoot-downs, but this would not be the case in the clashes which were to follow later that day. Argentine forces launched a wave of anti-shipping attacks, and unlike later in the war, the strike aircraft had a fighter cover. We will talk about these air battles in part 2 of our video. Be sure not to miss it when it comes out. Don't forget to press the like button, which is a huge help to the channel. Join our Patreon supporters or donate on PayPal to help even more, and keep watching Showtime 112.